Hello, I'm John. Welcome to my studio. This is a beginner's quilt emporium based in Tring in Hertfordshire. I am going to give you a little bit of a tour. We're going to have a little bit of a look around. So this is Sylvia. Sylvia.
Tomorrow.
She'll never look like this again. Sylvia is literally my right hand. There is no way I could find anything, do anything without her. It's all your fault. It's all your fault. So as you can see, that is the studio. Everybody who comes here always says, oh, it's a lot smaller than I thought it was. Well, I think it's quite huge. So you've got quite a big space over here. And it is a TARDIS because there is no unused space anywhere. Private stash, all of that over there. Now what we're going to do today, because we are doing the talk about the 100 quilts that have changed my life, I'm going to show you how it is I start off when a quilt comes in. So the very first thing that we need to do is you're going to take all those little bits of leftover wadding, and over here, and I'm going to get Sylvia to turn us down, you've got these wonderful runs that the machine goes on. Now I cleaned this 2 or 3 days ago, but look at that. It doesn't matter how often you clean this, you have to clean this every single time before a quilt goes on, because all the dust that accumulates with fabric, you have to get that off. And you can see all that dust collecting. When the wheels of the long arm quilter go over it, it will then mean that you may skip a stitch. It might not be as accurate. So you have to make sure that the threads that you're working on are as spotless as it can be. End. So the next thing is you need to take a wet wipe and you need to make sure that you wipe the surface completely all the way along. And this is literally done every 2 or 3 days in my studio. But if ever you want to see just how much dust comes onto the area, look at that. That's 2 or 3 days in the studio. And we clean like mad here. But it is literally the dust from fabric comes up everywhere. So if you've been cutting fabric in your area, you have to make sure that it is completely spotless. And normally we get 2 panels with 1 wet wipe. So we're going to get another wet wipe and carry on cleaning the whole area. When you finish doing that, this little run over here, you've got this blue line, which is where the machines go on. You make sure that you give that a good old clean as well. I normally try and get the girls to go over it with a hoover because you'll get tiny little bits of dirt in there and little hairs and things caught underneath it. You just got to suck those out as well because it can mess up the mechanism whilst you're quilting. So what I'm doing now as well is I always give the top a little bit of a sprinkle, a little bit of a spring clean as we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get Sylvia to come a bit closer. Bit closer. Oh, too close, too close. So what we're doing now is on a long arm quilting machine, you will see you've got all these different wheels. So there's one there. There is one over here. Hoping you can get in there. You've got one over there. You've got one over there. And on all 4 corners of the machine, you've got those. And then we've got this one as well. So what you need to do with these, there are 12 different wheels and mechanisms that you have to make sure is spotless. Best way of doing it that I've found is that wadding has a right and a wrong side. What I do is I take the right side of the wadding because it feels a little bit more bumpy. I take that and I put my finger quite tautly in it. And then I press it into the wheel. Now you can see on the edge there, there's not a lot. There's a tiny little bit of schmutz on there. You can see there's a tiny bit of schmutz over there. So what you do is you just put that in there and you push it away from you. And you push it towards you. And you know, I'm a bit of a lazy cleaner. I want the machine to work for me. And you can see there's not a lot coming off. It's just important that you always make sure that you're keeping your machine as spotless as you can. And you can then get those little bits out so that the wheel is completely clean all the way. It takes normally, I think, about 3 or 4 runs for it to be completely clean. And there you go. You can see my little wheel on the inside there is now spotless. Again, remember, you've got to make sure that the area that you're cleaning is also spotless as well. And then when you come to do these little legs over here, Sylvia is now going to be there. You do exactly the same thing. You put your finger along there. You attach it to the sides of one of those wheels. Might need to get you to go a little bit over here. Can you see that?
Just see your finger.
And when you move it away, thank you for following me, Sylvia, and you come back, you can see there's a tiny little thread there, and that, if you hadn't caught that, may get caught up in the mechanism, which would cause your machine to have a problem. And that's spotless. This wheel at the back, you do exactly the same thing. And again, like a bit like a lazy cleaner that I am, I let the machine do the work for me, and that is spotless. So these wheels won't have any problem at all. I do always run my finger without any tissue on it, any wadding on it as well, just to check that I haven't missed anything. Because sometimes when you put the wadding on, the wheel doesn't turn at all. But by moving the machine as well, you can feel if there are any dots. And I've just felt that there's a little dot over there. So you make, oh, don't ride over your wadding. You just make sure that you've got everything nice and spotless there by doing that. And you do this on all 4 ends of your machine. And as if by magic, when I'm back, it'll all be done. So by magic, all the wheels are cleaned. The machine is now completely spotless on the surface over there. I have taken my wadding and I have wiped all the bits down, but there are always bits that you won't get. So these wonderful little lint brushes, and you can use these on your normal sewing machine as well. These are perfect because what you do is you just go around and give it a good old dust. Because like even in these little ridges over here, you give that a good old dust, and you can see now I've got something here called a glide foot. This is what I prefer to use when I do quilting. Even that gets filled with schmutz. The dust that comes off quilting, you can imagine, you've seen when you do your normal sewing. I just give everything a good old wipe with one of these lint brushes. And you'll find even in these little corners over here, you'll see I just give that a good go because it just keeps everything nice and clean doing all of that. Now the next thing is I'm going to take the camera from good old Sylvia now, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you, forgive the mess of my studio, they all look like this. So now you can see this is the bobbin chamber, and even here you can see how much schmutz gets caught in the bobbin chamber here. So you give that a good old clean out as well. Oh, maybe I should have left this with Sylvia. And all you do next is you take out your bobbin. So my there's no bobbin in there. You just take that out and you could give everything a good old clean, a good old rub out with your lint brush. So now we've cleaned out the inside of the bobbin case. Now we've got the bobbin case. Now the bobbin case is one of those little creatures. You've got to really look after your bobbin cases. Not only because they're like 80 quid for a new one, but because if you look after your bobbin case and your tension is perfect on your bobbin, you then will have a much easier time when you're doing it. I have a business card here, and what I do is I take the business card and I put it on the edge there. Now, I know this is not COVID friendly. Now, the reason we do that is because on the bobbin over here, you might end up with a tiny little bit of schmutz in there, which can cause you no end of problems. Trust me, ask me how I know. Just do that and you can get everything out and it's all completely clear. If you think you haven't quite cleared it, not COVID friendly, don't do this at home. And don't touch anything I've done for 72 hours until after that. So once you've done all of that, you just get all the schmutz out, everything done. And I use what we call Magna Glide bobbins because it's got a lovely little magnet on one end and a normal on the other. And I think we've got about 170 meters of thread on that. And then you thread the bobbin, and that is, I'm happy with that. In fact, I think that might be a little loose. Oh. You always wondered what you use these tiny little screwdrivers for? That's better. Perfect. And now your bobbin's ready to go in. We just do a last quick brush with the thread just to check we've got everything out. And when we've done that, every bobbin, you go and you pop in a tiny drop of oil. Now, you drop the oil in on the base of your, I think Sylvia can get this shot if we go from above the shot. This little area here is where you dab your oil and literally one little drop. Come on, there you go. So that is all we're doing then before we put our bobbin in. And you then pop your bobbin in after that. So now we've got a clean machine, we've got the bobbin in, we've given everything a good clean over here. I always just double check that my foot is attached nice and firmly. Just give that a nice little tension on there. And then we've got to change our needles. Now the needle on here is a little bit more difficult to change because you don't have anything to line your needle up with. I'm using the special industrial sized needles over here. And a top tip with your needles is when the needle is coming out and it's okay, you can see it's rounded. When I've used the needle, I pop it in and I put the pointy end on the end because then I know that needle's done. Now we've got our brand new needle. What we're going to do is we're going to put this in. Now remember, like with normal sewing machine needles, the needle has a right and a wrong side. Your person will tell you how to put it in the right way around. Just make sure you get that right. You put the sharp end of your pin into the eye of the needle, and then what you do is you get this, you follow the eye of your needle along with this line over here to check that you've got it in correctly. Now this is too technical for today, so I will be back when I put the needle in. So in every studio, now what I've loved in this video is, have you noticed the detritus around it? Yep, this is my life, this is my house, this is my studio. What you need in every studio is a lovely lady who will come in and do all the ironing and the pressing, because the pressing of your backs, the pressing of your fronts is one of the most important things to do before you do it. Now what's perfect, before you move on, Sylvia, you can see over here your seam has flipped. Yeah. That will show. So what I always do is make sure that you check every single step along the way, that when you're doing it, that you press everything down. Press it from the back, and then once you press it from the front, voila, you can see. She's very quick though, our Sylvia.
Sorry.
She's very quick. Off she goes. Because you see, she does it so often, we get it done for that. But making sure that everything is pressed as flat as possible is the key. And now we're going to test her and see, does she get her whole seam correct? Will it be right? Will it be right? And it is. That's what comes from doing it so often. So we make sure that we do this, and once we've done the back, we make sure that we measure it, because the measuring is so, so important. She measures the quilts and checks everything, because measuring your quilts is so important. Even when you've measured it on the edges, like Sylvia's doing now, you need to make sure that you also measure it in the middle, because very occasionally there is a different size in the middle. And that's okay, just as long as you know what you're doing and where you are. And if there is a difference, as long as you know, it's really, really, really important to check. You good in the middle?
Not bad, not bad.
Brilliant. Some quilts I've had have been 2 or 3 inches bigger in the middle than on the outside. That's about bias, that's about different angles, and that's absolutely fine. You mustn't ever worry about that. It just, as long as we know, we can then alternate things and do things correctly to make sure that we can cater for those differences. Well, Sylvia can. So now you're at the point where you're ready to start putting everything on. So you've got 4 different poles. This pole on my machine, this is not on all machines, this pole holds the bottom of the back of the quilt, and you always make sure that it is face to the floor. Okay, it's really important. Ask me how I know. Nothing worse than getting the quilt the wrong way around. But luckily that was on my own, and you only do it the once. So make sure that that's on there. All you do, it's so complicated. Watch. Wait, first of all, you need a single pin. The pin has to hang out the side of your mouth, okay? Pretend you're a smoker. What you do then is you take this, you fold it in half, and you create a half mark over there. Now, my lovely client has created a double-sided quilt. We will come to that in a few moments. And then once I've created that half mark, you then take that little crease and you line it up with the exact half point on what is known as your leaders. And you put this just a little bit lower than 1/4 of an inch down. So now my quilt top is attached. And now what you do is you attach these all the way along the quilt, leaving about just bigger than it's a finger and a half, and you're leaving about 1 1/4 fingers of gap between them. all the way along, you're lining the top of the fabric to the top of the leaders, and you're making sure that you're putting these down consistently. So the top of the fabric there hits the top of the leaders, and you're making sure you're going in a straight line over there, leaving roughly a finger width apart all the way along. Stop. So what we've done now is we have now pinned this end of the backing on. You will notice that half the pins go in this direction and half the pins go in the opposite direction. You will see why in a few moments, and it is really important that you do that, because when you are pushing your quilt out, you start in the middle and you push out. If you've got all these pins pointing the same way as these pins and you push out, you're going to stab your hand. Ask me how I know. So now what we do is we make sure that you put this underneath this bar over here, and then you take this, you fold this in half. Also, COVID not friendly, sorry. Fold this in half, and you get your halfway mark, and then you attach that just like you did the other side. Edge of the fabric up to the edge of your leaders, and you just pin these on. Now on this back run, you don't need to worry about your pins going in opposite directions. I have all of my pins going, pointing towards that way. I don't know which way that is in the camera, because my machine moves from left to right when you're looking at the machine. So I always have my pins going that direction as well. Whether that's right or not, that may be dealer's choice, but that's the way I do it. So now what we've done is we have pinned both sides of the top and the bottom of the back of the quilt on. And what you're going to do now is you're going to make sure that you pull this relatively taut before you start winding. And before you start winding, you then check that the leaders are lined up. Is it strobing?
No.
Okay. So what you do now is you start to wind it on. Can you come here? And as you start winding it on, you need to make sure that the edge of your fabric here is lining up with the edge of the fabric underneath. So you can see there's an ever so slight minimal amount there that's going a little bit off. So remember I said that you move your hands along the fabric to line it up? That's what we're doing there. And you can see it's going a little bit off. You just then keep following it along, and it's not too much of a problem on the back because you've got those extra inches on the back to cover you. I don't worry about it lining up exactly right on the back, unless it's a double-sided quilt like this one, that you need to make sure that this is centralized. This is going fine for me. I'm happy with this. But if you are straightening it out, you need to make sure that you're going out like this, which is why our pins are lined up that way. Now on a quilt like this, you will see that you've got little purple strands coming through. What you would want to do there is either cut these off or pull them off, because the last thing you want is a purple strand in the middle of a cream backing. And that's when the threads all go over the floor, and then it's a Sylvia problem again.
Joe.
Oh no, it's a Joe problem at that point. And you just do this all the way along. Now, at this point over here, you'll see as I've been winding, this has gone a bit funny. So what I do now is I unwind the whole bit, another little section, just to make sure I get that all lined up a bit better. So winding the quilt on, you can see that's absolutely perfect. So you've got to pay attention to so many different aspects of the quilt as you're doing it to make sure. Now, the reality is that this seam may not have been straight in the first place, and that's absolutely fine. But you can see the way I've wound it on now, it's a lot straighter than it was. So it's very important to always look at the seams of your quilt as you go along, as you're winding it on, to make sure you're getting the straightest that you can for the back. Equally, remember when you've got a big lump of fabric in the middle, you're going to have seams. And when these seams pile on top of each other, you're going to have a much thicker area here than you would here, for example, because here's just plain fabric. Whereas here you've got multiple seams, multiple layers, and it's just important to keep an eye on it as you're winding the quilt on to make sure that everything is not only lined up, but also rolling on to be even. Pulling away all the little threads that you can as you go. Now, as I've pulled that on, you can see over here is much tauter than over here. That is normal because of all those seams. So I just give that a little bit of a pull and I feel on the way. And if there are any ripples in this, having done that, I undo everything. And that has worked perfectly. And you just keep winding until it is absolutely the way you want it to be, and nice, as flat as it can be. And there we go. One quilt back attached to the top, taking off all the little strands of thread that may cause discoloration on your back of your quilt. Now what we do is we attach the top, and just like we did the back, we folded this in half. We put this again right side up. So you always remember on your quilting, it's right sides outside. And you've got your central line marked up. And I'm going to turn this the other way because one of the faces was going to be upside down there. Because this is a scrappy quilt, the client doesn't really mind which way around it goes. That one's going that way. Yep, that's the way I'm going to do it. And again, really simple. You fold that in half. You grab a pin, and that halfway mark, you're going to line up to the halfway mark of your leaders. And just like before, you get the edge of your fabric lined up with the edge of your leader, and you put a pin in just bigger than 1/4 inch all the way down. And you pin this in 2 different directions all the way along your quilt. Exactly the same as you did with your back. And for ease, I'm going to show you over here, you're going in the opposite direction to these pins, just so that when you're winding it on, you want to make sure that the pins are going in opposite directions to the way that you will be manipulating the fabric. And there we go. We are now officially pinned on. I always drag this over the machine because it adds a tiny little bit of tension to the quilt. As I then do this, I need to attach, make sure my leaders are all lined up over here. And over there. And then I wind the quilt on. Before I actually get to the point of the leaders of the quilt being wound on, I double check that my leaders are all in the right place. And you then wind on the quilt. Now, if you remember, we measured this quilt not only on the end, but on the middle, and this quilt was a 1/2 inch shorter in the middle than it was on the ends, that is not a problem at all. And the reason I know that that's important is as I now wind towards the middle over here, the edges here will no longer line up. And I know that's happening and I know that's coming. So I'm expecting it. And I've started to increase a little bit there and a little bit there. So I know that that's meant to be happening, and that is all good. So there we go. We've got the top and the bottom all lined up, and we're ready to attach the wadding. So now what we do is we've now rolled the top on. We've got the wadding ready to go. We've got a double-sided quilt here. So what I've done is I've made sure that I've got the quilt positioned just right for my clients as to where they want the backing to go. And then what I do is I line the wadding up and I make sure that I've got everything nice and taut in the right place. And then once I'm happy with where everything's lying, I bring over my long arm and I start doing tension tests. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to always make sure that I bring the threads of my machine to the top. Now, the reason why that is so important is if you've got these long dangly threads, and sometimes you do have long dangly threads, and you've got all these gear mechanisms underneath it, and those long tangly threads get caught up in the gears, you're going to cause problems for your machine. So any form of free motion embroidery, any form of free motion in quilting, any form of quilting, get into the good habit of pulling those threads to the top. It just makes life a lot easier. And then if you have got a random thread on the back, it's a problem. And then you need to go and look into what that is. So all I'm doing now is to start my tension process here, because you've got to take quite a while to test your tension and check everything's right. I'm putting my horizontal lock on, and all I'm doing is I'm going to be now pushing this along and stitching in a straight line using my horizontal threads, the horizontal locks. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a nice straight line to be able to attach the top of my quilt to. And now you've got that central line. Once you've got that central line, you bring the top of your quilt back and you pull that up. Now you'll see I haven't got quite enough space to line that up. So I just pull that a little bit more forward. And then I can see that's not quite right. I pull that down and we go from there. So with the tension testing, that is the most important part of any form of quilt that you're doing. Not only are you going to run the test on the top to check that everything's right, you're also going to go underneath. Now, as you get doing this for a while, you'll notice that you can run your finger under it and you can see if there's a problem. But most quilters, what they don't show you is you spend most of your time on your bum under the quilt looking up. It's normal. All of us do it. Ugh. Don't look at my ass. And that actually looks quite good. I'm happy with that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this down and I'm going to double check the width that this needs to be for my client, making sure that I've got the back in the correct place. And that measurement is 3 3/4. So that's about 1/4 inch too high up. So I pull that down. Because it's a double-sided quilt, this works a little bit differently. And there we go. So now what I do, again, I put my horizontal lock on, and I'm going to go and start stitching my top down to the quilt. And you'll see I've got a tiniest little bit of what I'm going to call edging over here. It's less than 1/4 inch. And you just want to attach the quilt down so that this is now completely taut. You're then going to start stitching down the sides, and it is going to make sure that the quilt is perfectly placed for any quilting. So what we've done now is we've stitched the top, we've stitched the sides. So we've got the tension ready on the top and we've got the tension on the side. But you also need to, when you're quilting, attach some clamps on the edge because quilting fabric normally does like to do that. So what you're going to attach is these wonderful little side clamps over here and pull these along to get a tension. Now what you're looking for is to have that the clamp attaches and when you pull it, it's tight. You do not want a bow on the outside. That's going to mess up your quilting design or your quilting pattern. So you're just trying to find that fine line between the two. So as you can see on that one over there now, that is a good tension. And that one is a good tension because it hasn't, the wires are still wobbly. This is still in a straight line. Nothing's curving out. You'll know that if this curves out, it's not right. It's too tight. So you do that on both sides of the quilts. And when everybody says to you, the long arm quilter says to you, we need 3 or 4 inches on either side, this is why. Because if you haven't got these tensions on the side, it is very possible that you will end up not having a nice clean edge on this. But equally, when you've got the clamps on, your machine has got to go to the edge. And you can see, even with this, there's not enough room for you to get any tension on it. So by having the clamp there, you haven't got a lot of room on this. So it's really important that you make sure that you do give your long arm quilter 4 inches on each side. Because if your tension isn't 100% the first time, you've got to keep doing those tension checks. And if you get it wrong and you run out of fabric, it is really hard for your long arm quilter. So I know for you, you're thinking, oh, that's an extra 8 inches of fabric, that's another meter. I know that's a lot. Use scrap fabric if needs be, because you only need to have that there. But having that edge, it really makes our lives a lot easier trying to figure that all out. And now we're ready to load the quilt onto the machine. So what you do when you've had this really long consultation with your client, and this is now the most complicated bit, is picking the design and picking the thread color to go on it. When you put your thread color on, it is really, really important that you take your thread color and you lay it over all of the areas of your fabric to find the right color for you. This can be done via Zoom. This can be done online. That's absolutely fine. You just have that problem with technology. The colors that you're seeing of this quilt, when the computer camera takes the camera picture and then I convert it to video and you're seeing it on your screens, you've had 3 or 4 different translations of the color, which means the color that you're getting is not the same color as what this purple is in real life. So you've got that slight problem with the Zoom aspect. So being able to see the quilt, see everything, lay the thread on top of it makes your life a lot easier, and you end up with a much nicer quilt and a much nicer effect on it as well. So I'm lucky enough now, Sylvia and I are in a bubble, we've been able to do that. So you do this. So you get all of that planned, ready to go. You get there. Now, just to give you all a heads up, what we filmed, which is only a few minutes as a video, maybe 10-15 minutes, this has taken us 2 hours to set on, to get this quilt on, get it all set up, get everything cut, everything measured, everything pressed, everything lined up, everything cleaned. We're at 2 hours now. So when you are looking at a long arm quilting process, this will take about 2 hours to stitch out. So it's a 4 to 5 hour process to quilt this quilt. It is 40 inches by 60. So it's a good 4 or 5 hour process to be able to stitch that out. So when you are taking it to a long arm, just remember that is a huge amount of time that goes into the prep, because if you've got everything ready on the prep, it just works a lot easier. When I come now, ready to press the button. Remember, always to the top with your threads. And normally, if Sylvia wasn't filming, I'd get Sylvia to press the green button to go. And when she does, the minute her finger touches the button, I bark at her. Just to give her a little bit of a fright, keep her on her toes, gotta be done. And then we go off and we've got the stitching process in play.